In the hyper-analytical, deeply paranoid, and relentlessly speculative ecosystem of the National Hockey League off-season rumor cycle, the Whisper Network has a well-documented and historically consistent tendency to escalate from measured organizational pivot to full corporate detonation narrative with the speed and the destructive enthusiasm of a wildfire discovering a fresh supply of organizational kindling. Have you ever watched a multi-billion-dollar franchise under the suffocating pressure of consecutive playoff failures and a recently restructured front office desperately searching for its own organizational identity, completely and voluntarily surrender its existing championship window in order to liquidate its single most electrifying, most financially productive, and most competitively irreplaceable asset in exchange for a collection of theoretical lottery tickets whose eventual competitive value exists entirely in the imagination of the executives authorizing transaction? We are sealing the doors to the tactical war room with maximum analytical urgency today, because the Whisper Network has officially, comprehensively, and perhaps irreversibly lost its collective mind. Dave Jenkins has just published a blockbuster trade blueprint linking Toronto Maple Leafs superstar William Nylander to the Seattle Kraken in a futures-heavy asset exchange that reads less like a serious organizational proposal and more like a creative writing exercise conducted in complete isolation from the unforgiving mathematical reality of the National Hockey League salary cap. Grab your collective bargaining agreements, pull up your complete salary cap ledgers, and prepare your analytical minds for the most financially uncompromising forensic dissection this channel has delivered surrounding a single trade proposal. We are about to surgically expose every structural flaw, every cap sheet impossibility, and every contractual hallucination embedded within what the mainstream hockey media is presenting as a serious organizational blueprint, but what our war room immediately identifies as a massive, multidimensional administrative fantasy. Let us immediately and without any organizational sentiment establish the full structural reality of what trading William Nylander actually signifies for the Toronto Maple Leafs at this precise moment in their organizational history. Because the framing of this transaction matters as much as its financial mechanics in understanding why the proposal is fundamentally incompatible with any version of organizational logic that does not involve the complete and total abandonment of the Auston Matthews competitive era. You do not trade a 29-year-old 40-goal scorer operating at the absolute apex of his physical prime, his biomechanical efficiency, and his offensive hockey intelligence unless the organizational decision to abandon all remaining championship ambitions surrounding the current core has been made with complete, irrevocable, publicly committed finality. William Nylander is not a depreciating asset approaching the end of his competitive relevance. He is not a veteran rental whose value peaks at the trade deadline and evaporates the following July. He is a generational offensive talent in the precise middle of his athletic prime, producing a level that places him among the most dangerous and most valuable forwards in the entire Eastern Conference, a player whose combination of zone entry brilliance, power play orchestration, and playoff performance elevation represents exactly the kind of irreplaceable offensive infrastructure that championship rosters are built to protect and preserve rather than liquidate for future considerations. If this specific proposal reaches the boardroom table in any serious organizational context, it does not signal a retool, a pivot, or a measure competitive recalibration. It signals a complete, unconditional execution of a scorched earth corporate reset so total and so organizationally devastating in its immediate competitive consequences that it simultaneously and permanently closes the championship window of the most expensive player in NHL history, Auston Matthews. While he is still theoretically in his prime and still theoretically capable of leading this franchise to the Stanley Cup that his career has been demanding for the better part of a decade, the incoming assets referenced in the proposal highly touted defensive prospect Jake O'Brien, the signing rights to defenseman Blake Fiddler, a 2026 first-round draft selection, and a 2027 second-round draft selection, represent a precise financial and developmental currency of a genuine organizational rebuild, the kind of futures-heavy asset accumulation that rebuilding franchises pursue over multiple seasons of intentional competitive sacrifice and deliberate roster deconstruction. Freeze your analytical processing completely and force yourself to examine the actual competitive geometry of that proposed return package with a cold, unsentimental clarity. that a transaction of this magnitude demands before a single dollar of organizational capital is committed to its execution. You are being asked to surrender a guaranteed elite offensive anchor, a player producing 40 goals and consistent postseason excellence on a 6-year contract that provides the acquiring team with years of cost-certain, production-predictable superstar deployment, in exchange for theoretical potential measured in draft positions and prospect rankings that have not yet been validated by a single shift of meaningful NHL competition. Jake O'Brien is a genuinely phenomenal organizational piece whose defensive upside and physical profile generate legitimate excitement within analytical communities that track prospect development with rigorous attention. But draft capital, regardless of its round designation or its organizational enthusiasm, does not score critical goals on a Tuesday night in November when the Metropolitan Division is applying maximum pressure to your defensive structure and your power play needs a world-class finisher to break the game open. If Toronto accepts a return package containing 0 NHL-ready, immediately deployable assets flowing back across the trade wire, they are not executing a strategic organizational pivot. They are waving the white flag on the Auston Matthews championship era with a definitiveness and a public visibility that no subsequent organizational decision can reverse or reframe. We must now aggressively and immediately redirect our full analytical attention to the single most important, most organizationally consequential, and most completely ignored element of this entire trade proposal: the contractual reality that renders the entire transaction dependent not on the agreement of 2 general managers, not on the satisfaction of 2 ownership groups, and not on the mathematical compatibility of 2 salary cap sheets, but on the personal, voluntary, entirely unchallengeable decision of a single human being who holds more organizational power over his own destiny than any executive currently drawing a salary from Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. William Nylander's 6-year contract extension carries an annual average value of $11,500,000 and contains embedded within its legal architecture a full, completely non-negotiable no-movement clause that grants him absolute, dictatorial, and legally unassailable authority over every geographic dimension of any trade scenario the organization attempts to construct around his services. In the corporate hierarchy of the modern NHL, that specific contractual provision does not merely complicate the organizational logistics of executing a trade involving Nylander. It establishes him as the undisputed, unchallengeable chief executive officer of his own professional destiny, a position of organizational power so complete that no general manager, no ownership group, and no amount of media-generated trade speculation can override it without his explicit, written, and freely given consent. For this specific transaction to advance beyond the conceptual stage of a sports media creative exercise and enter the realm of actual organizational execution, the incoming Toronto management group must be prepared to engage in a sustained, psychologically sophisticated, and professionally delicate campaign of executive persuasion directed at a superstar who has publicly stated his preference for remaining with the franchise and who possesses the contractual tools to enforce that preference with complete legal authority. They must march into Nylander's organizational space, make the explicit organizational declaration that the roster is being systematically and comprehensively detonated in pursuit of a long-term competitive rebuild, and construct a sufficiently compelling professional argument that voluntarily waiving the contractual protection he negotiated specifically to prevent this kind of organizational dislocation represents his best available career decision at age 29. The front office must somehow convince a player in the absolute prime of his athletic career, producing at an elite offensive level, and contractually secured against exactly this organizational scenario, that relocating to the Pacific Northwest to join a Seattle Kraken franchise that has not yet established itself as a genuine championship contender serves his personal and professional interests better than remaining in the largest hockey market in North America, surrounded by the most offensively talented core he will ever play alongside. He holds a pen on every document that matters. If he exercises his contractual right and declines a waive, the entire Seattle blueprint disintegrates instantaneously and completely, leaving the Toronto front office exactly where it started, holding an $11.5 million superstar contract and no viable path to force its movement. This brings the full devastating weight of our forensic audit to the most glaring, most mathematically offensive, and most completely inexplicable structural flaw embedded within the Jenkins proposal. The flaw that should have terminated the mainstream media's serious engagement with this blueprint at the moment of its first analytical examination. The proposal suggests that the Seattle Kraken will be sending back prospects and draft picks as a primary, possibly exclusive, compensation flowing to Toronto in exchange for absorbing Nylander's $11,500,000 annual average value cap commitment. Let us conduct the most basic, most elementary financial autopsy that this transaction demands and expose the complete mathematical impossibility of that specific asset structure with the blunt clarity of simple arithmetic. The National Hockey League operates under a hard salary cap ceiling that functions as an absolute rigid, completely inflexible mathematical boundary above which no franchise can legally commit salary cap resources regardless of ownership wealth, market size, or organizational ambition. There are no exceptions, no emergency waivers, and no creative accounting mechanisms that allow a franchise to exceed that boundary by a single dollar without triggering automatic and immediate league intervention. Unless the Seattle Kraken have been quietly, secretly, and improperly accumulating over $11 million in available salary cap space through a combination of strategic asset management and deliberate roster construction decisions that have somehow escaped the attention of every credible salary cap analyst covering the Western Conference, the physical, mathematical, thermodynamic reality of absorbing Nylander's contract without sending a single active NHL player contract back to Toronto in exchange is a complete and total financial impossibility that no amount of creative proposal writing can make executable. For Seattle to legitimately acquire the kind of box office, franchise-redefining superstar that Nylander's offensive profile represents, they must simultaneously and necessarily offload significant, meaningful, immediately cap-relevant salary from their own books to create the financial space his contract demands. That organizational reality introduces a layer of transactional complexity that the Jenkins proposal either deliberately ignores or fundamentally fails to understand. Because the moment Seattle introduces active NHL contracts into compensation package flowing back to Toronto, the entire value calculation of the transaction changes in ways that dramatically and potentially fatally undermine the organizational logic of the Maple Leafs accepting the deal. If Toronto is required to absorb bad contracts, expiring but temporarily useful roster fillers, or aging veterans with declining production curves in order to make the cap mathematics of the transaction functional, the draft picks and prospect included in the package immediately depreciate in organizational value because their financial benefit is being partially or fully offset by the cap obligations arriving simultaneously from the other direction. The mainstream hockey media has a deeply ingrained, historically consistent, and analytically inexcusable habit of constructing these blockbuster superstar for prospects proposals in a state of complete financial isolation from the cap sheet reality that governs every single transaction executed in the modern NHL. And the Jenkins-Seattle proposal represents one of the most egregious examples of that analytical failure that this channel has been asked to examine all offseason. The Seattle Kraken possess genuine, legitimate organizational motivation to pursue a transaction of this nature. They desperately, urgently, and publicly need a game-breaking offensive superstar capable of legitimizing their attack and establishing the